I have supplied a preset especially for this project. It is based on the 2D animation preset, but some things have been altered for final output. My grease pencil object is named Illustration Template, and I've set up some basic layers, which generally follow my creation process. I've also added a couple of palettes to this file, which I find useful to have, and a couple of brushes have also been imported. I have a graphite pencil, a rough ink, and even some halftone brushes. Now you may be wondering how to add these yourself, so let's go through the process of adding the bubble brush we created in a previous lesson. I like to save all of the brushes I create in a single blend file, and I have also supplied this blend file with some brushes in case you haven't got one of your own. Go to the File menu, Append, and navigate to this blend file. Now here's a tip. Did you know you can filter assets inside of a blend file? You'll see that I've unticked everything except brushes here. I'll tick the Fake User checkbox as well, and then click on Append. Now the brush folder should appear, and the bubble brush should be easy enough to find in here. Once you click Append, the bubble brush should now appear, complete with its thumbnail, in your brushes menu. I'll now save my working file and begin to sketch. I always begin with a rough sketch. My pencil red brush has got the graphite texture that we created in a previous lesson, and I've given it this pinkish hue from my drafting colors palette. I mainly use this brush here as my drafting pencil. In my rough sketch, I try to get down the overall scale, lines of motion, volume, and I generally start at the head, then draw the line of action along which the torso will be aligned. I'll then sketch out limbs, legs, arms, hands, and so on. If you've enabled the Grease Pencil Tools add-on, there is a camera flip toggle you can use. Flipping is common practice. It's to check that your proportions look correct if the image is mirrored. Control-Tab brings up your radial menu, allowing you to select from all the modes. But if you just hit Tab, you can toggle between the current mode and the previously used mode. When I'm in edit mode, I like to enable the proportional fall-off. This often helps with adjusting some of the pose or the scale or just moving a limb down a little bit, and by just pulling and pushing the points with proportional fall-off, you can affect most of the drawing. Now, if something is pushed beyond its limits, I'll toggle back into draw mode, erase some of these lines, and redraw them. Now, here's another tip. If you hold down Control while drawing, you can switch your brush to an eraser. But what you need to know is that the type of eraser that you use will be whatever the default is set at, or whatever eraser was used last. If, like me, you have a preferred erase tool, mine happens to be the Erase by Stroke, and you want this to be the eraser that your pencil switches to, while you're in draw mode, first select the eraser tool. Then select the type of eraser you prefer, try erasing something, and then reselect your draw tool. Now when you hold down Control, the draw tool will toggle automatically to that specific eraser. Once I'm happy with the overall pose, I'll add a new sketch layer and reduce the opacity of the original sketch. I'll lock off the original sketch layer and select my new layer for drawing. I generally change the color of the graphite pencil so I can better see how parts of the clothing might obscure parts of the figure, and I can differentiate between the basic anatomy and the accessories. Here's another tip. By default, the color switching for color attributes hasn't got a shortcut key assigned to it. So if you right-click on the flip color symbol, that's these two arrows in a circle, you can assign one that you might use often. Personally, I like to use the X key. But this can get confusing because X also is for delete in other modes. You can choose to assign a key modifier to this or another key entirely. Once the sketch has been completed, you might want to merge these layers down just to simplify your layering system so it doesn't get overly complicated. But in general, I like to keep things separate because while it's easy enough to polish and edit a demonstration such as what you're looking at, the reality is you're going to switch back and forth between layers, colors, and tools as you work. Once you're satisfied with your overall sketch, it's time to move on to refining. Now, the refined sketch might seem like an unnecessary step. You might be satisfied with your sketch and want to go straight to inking. But even the most seasoned professionals will have a refined sketch. This is usually the pencils you see shared on social media, because this is where you lay down things like shading and volume and line weight so that you can pass this on to an inker and they'll have all the information they need to put their inks on top. I'm once again going to use my graphite pencil brush, but I'll change my color to a dark gray. I'll select this from my values palette. I don't want it exactly black because I do want to have a little bit of variation between this and the inks that I'll use at the end. This sketch is going to go over everything we've laid down so far, but here is where we add details. With the basic roughs underneath, it should be easy enough to figure out where parts overlap. Usually there are shadows like under the chin, or if the light direction is generally coming from up top, anything that we're looking at the underside of should be shaded a little darker. If an area should be shaded, but fill light is going to illuminate parts of that, I generally just like to use a little bit of light hatching. Of course, it takes a lot of practice to draw things like figures, props, clothing, hair, and to get it all working together. Now, studying these areas individually is a really good idea. If you have the ability to, I highly recommend attending some life drawing classes. Now, if you prefer to work more privately, there is always a wealth of reference pose packs, both free and paid, all over the internet. Now, I'm generally happy with this refined sketch. I'm just going to go over a few areas, do a little bit of touch-up. And now anything under the refined sketch, I'll make invisible. And I'm now ready to commence on the inks. Depending on the style you're going for, inking can be a finishing step, or a layer which defines the forms and details more clearly. There are many ways to lay down inks, but the methods which I choose to ink in grease pencil are usually ones which consider the steps to come. Inks are different from the refined sketch, in that there shouldn't be any guesswork. I like inking with the default brush that already comes with grease pencil, although I usually enable stabilized stroke, which isn't enabled by default for this brush. Sometimes, however, I want something a little rougher. I've included a custom brush, which will simulate the effect of a slightly broken, much-loved pen, but can give you some really nice irregular effects. There's not much more to say about inking other than, keep in mind things like line weight and don't over ink. You don't want to do a lot of unnecessary hatching, unnecessary lines. Everything about your inks has got to be something that brings meaning to the overall illustration. Now, once I'm happy with my ink pass, I'm ready to move on to my color flatting. Painting an illustration should feel free and easy, and you should be able to layer up your work as you see fit. However, when painting with grease pencil, it's important to remember that it works more like a vector paint program than a bitmap one. In any process, there will always be times where things can get a little tedious. For me, color flatting is that time. In this step, I'm going to show you a couple of techniques that I use to put down color flats as efficiently as possible. I start by adding a new layer and naming it mask. I'll select my fill tool and set the fill to inverted. Tinkering with your precision, dilate, contract, or thickness settings are certainly things to consider. Then just click outside the silhouette of your character. You can always undo this step if the fill isn't acting correctly. Change some of your settings and then try another fill. You'll see that my ink layer is set above my mask layer. Under my advanced brush settings, I'm going to set my layers to layer above. Now, Simplify will remove points from the final shape, but often this leads to more errors than it solves. Gap Closure will detect a threshold for acceptable gaps to ignore. There will often be gaps you overlooked, so extending this even a little bit should be beneficial to your process. Now, for really big, obvious gaps, you should probably place a boundary stroke to temporarily close a gap. You do this by holding down Alt while using your fill tool, and then drawing a boundary across the gap you wish to close. A quick note, boundary strokes are invisible when you're in rendered view, so if you want to see them as you draw, I recommend switching over to material view. Cleaning up boundary strokes is as simple as going into edit mode, and under the grease pencil menu, go to Clean Up Boundary Strokes. Now, once you're happy with your settings, you've got any boundaries in place, we'll fill the mask. I tend to choose a color attribute that really stands out. Now, your mask might need a little cleanup, and it's worth taking the time to fix some of the errors rather than try and get the perfect fill first go. A good mask should fit the outer boundary of your inks. This is so our colors will overlap the ink work when we begin to place them. I'll lock my mask layer so that I don't accidentally draw or color on it. And if it's not there already, I'll move my color layer above it. Now for this, you'll need to create your own palette, or you can import the one I've prepared for this demonstration. The technique here is very easy. You can just use the append function. Obviously, the next step here is to flat out areas of color. On my color layer, I'll enable masks by either clicking on this dot icon, or in the section below, tick the box labeled Masks. You might have to open this section to see the dialog box underneath it, and click the Layers Specials button, that's this plus sign here, to add a layer. I can now select Mask from the drop-down. Now select the default inking brush, set the material to solid fill, and select your custom color palette from the color attributes. Set your inks layer to hard light transfer mode, and as you select colors from your attributes palette, begin to fill areas of color by drawing a lasso around each area. Now, while the outer boundaries will be limited by the mask, you will need to trace out different colored areas so they sit well under the inks. As I fill in the colors, I can see exactly where those color boundaries will sit up against each other. If there's an overlap between areas, the foreground line should take precedence. At any time, you can toggle into edit mode, select a shape, and arrange it by sending it back or forward in the stack. Or you can select nuclear options such as send all the way to the back or all the way to the front. Good flatting takes time, and often selecting and moving individual points, even with proportional fall-off enabled, can be tedious. Now, another technique you can use if this is too much work is to rough out the areas just inside the line work, then switch your inking material to a stroke and carefully fill in the remainder as if you were painting. These strokes are far easier to edit as well. If you set your fall off to connected only, then no other fills or strokes will be affected as you manipulate or scale these points. Now, as a finishing touch, I like to duplicate my inks layer, and I'll reset the topmost inks layer to a regular blend mode, so the original black is what you see here. But I'm going to drop its opacity slightly so that the inks layer that still has the hard light blend mode will show through a little bit. Hard light gives a wonderful tint to our inks, which makes our illustration already look warmer and more vibrant. Depending on the style of illustration that you're trying to produce, there are several ways that you can add shading and highlights. Now, the easiest technique is just to paint in black and white. Your shadows should be on a layer that is set to a multiply blend mode, and your highlights should sit on a separate layer, and this should be set to add. Now, you'll have to imagine the light direction to understand where you should place your shadows and highlights. Selecting my shadow layer, I'll begin to paint over areas which should be darker in relation to the light source. If these shadows appear too dark, drop the opacity until you get a good general transfer of this layer. If you want to work with a rougher brush, this could add a lot of texture to your artwork, but you might want the areas around the outer silhouette of your illustration to be crisp and clean. To do this, all you have to do is add a mask to this layer, much the same way that we did for colors. Painting highlights is pretty much the opposite. Your highlights layer is set to add, and so painting in white is going to add this value to any color value underneath. Again, you might have to adjust the opacity of this layer to get a good general value system that works for your overall illustration. And your strokes or fills should be placed closest to the light source. Now, if you want to lift your game a little bit without too much fuss, paint in a variety of grays. Instead of just using black, you can use lighter shades of grey for areas which should naturally have a little bit of subsurface scattering or should be a little bit more diffuse. The same goes for your highlights. Now already you should see a vast improvement in your shading. Using hard light instead of multiply will alter how your shading layer will affect the underlying values. And combine this with painting in a variety of grey tones, and you'll already feel as though you've leveled up again. Now, my third tip is for the pros. Don't shade with values, shade with colors. I like to do this on a separate layer, but the way I choose the colors is to eyedropper the selected area that I wish to shade, then lower that value before painting in my shadows, or increase the value before painting with highlights. I can save these colors to my existing palette, and I can organize my colors in a variety of ways. I can even choose complementary colors to add extra backlights or vibrancy to the overall image. However you wish to shade, what you're looking to do is to add dimension and volume. Also, because everything is put on separate layers, you should be able to access each layer separately so that you can go back and retouch as you progress further with your illustration. Let's make a background for our character now. I'll make my character invisible and create a new grease pencil object. Let's name this background. In our object properties, relabel the default GP layer to sky. We'll be appending some materials from the Chapter 2 exercise, but as a refresher, let's make a simple gradient material. In our material properties, we should have a default stroke material named black. Let's add a new material slot and give this a name. I'll call mine Gradient Sky 01. I'll untick stroke and tick fill. I'll change the style from solid to gradient and leave it as linear. And I'll pick some colors from our Bubblegum Girl palette. You can do this by toggling into draw mode so that the color panel shows up under our tool settings. Then clicking on the base color swatch, you can eyedropper select one of the colors. I'll do the same with my secondary color. Let's set the blend to 0 and rotate the gradient -90 degrees. Now we'll probably have to position and scale this later to make sure it fits correctly, but this will do for now. In draw mode, select the ink pen brush and check that the material is set to this new Gradient Sky 01 material that we've just created. Let's also make sure we're toggled into material paint mode and not color attributes mode. Select our box tool and draw out a rectangle that exceeds the border of our camera. You may have to zoom out a little for this, and if you don't manage it the first time, don't worry, we can always toggle into edit mode and fix it there. If the gradient doesn't look correct, we should go ahead and tweak the location and scale settings directly under the fill options in our material properties until we get it looking the way we want. Let's now create our mask. In our Properties panel, add a new layer and name it Mask. Let's make sure this layer is selected to draw on. In our Material settings, add a new material slot and select our solid fill from the drop-down. This should already be there by default. Now toggle into draw mode, change the ink pen brush material to our solid fill and select our circle tool. Hold down Shift as we draw out a circle so that its proportions are constrained. You may have seen the A4 template with crop marks and safe areas that's been overlaid on our work so far. I like to use these so that we can align anything a little bit better. In our layer properties, we can now assign this layer as a mask for our sky layer. Where this layer sits in the stack doesn't matter, but I like to place mine lower down. It's also a good idea to drop the opacity of the mask layer to 0. If we make it invisible, this will disable the mask, and we don't want that. We should now have a gradient sky that fits inside this circle as our background. Ready to make things a little bit more interesting? I'll lock my sky layer and select my mask layer. I'll toggle into edit mode so that I can see my points. I'll select all, use Shift D to duplicate, and then scale these up. I'm going to select the black stroke material from the drop-down and assign it. This will now give us a nice ring around our circle. We may have to scale the thickness of this a little by hitting Alt S. I might do this once or twice more, and each concentric ring that I scale out, I might scale the thickness down a little bit. I like how this is looking, but let's get even crazier. I'll add a new material slot, and if it isn't present already from the drop-down, append a halftone texture from our Exercise 2 Materials Blend file. In our Properties, let's unlock the sky layer and lock the mask layer. In Edit mode, select the sky fill shape. You can do this by selecting one of the points and then just hitting L anywhere near that, and this should select all. Then hit Shift D to duplicate this. Hit the M key, and this should bring up our layers contextual menu. Let's move this duplicate to a new layer and call this layer mask_pattern. While the duplicate is still selected, let's assign the halftone texture to this fill. You can tweak the settings as you like. I generally like to rotate my halftone about 30 or 45 degrees and scale it up or down slightly depending on how big or small the original tile was. Now let's make sure that the mask pattern layer sits above the mask layer. The order is important when adding more than one mask to a layer. I'll drop its opacity down to 0 as well and lock it. I'll unlock my sky layer and add the new mask, selecting the mask pattern layer. Now I'll invert the mask so that the halftone pattern is actually added to the negative space. This is looking great. But hands up if you want to go even further. Let's create a new holdout material. We can add a slot, select the solid fill from the drop-down and duplicate it, then rename it holdout and tick the holdout box under the fill settings. I'm going to append our cloud objects from the Lesson 1 exercise file. We might need to toggle into front view to see them depending on the scale of your project. Now position and scale them down so that they overlap with this background circle. Then, with all of the cloud objects selected, let's hit Ctrl J to merge them all together. I'm also going to apply all transforms to this grease pencil object. Then I'll toggle into edit mode, select all, and copy. I'll toggle back out to object mode and make this object invisible. We might also want to disable it from any renders if you're going to leave this in the project. I'll select the background grease pencil object, add a new layer, and toggle into edit mode, and paste. With all the cloud's fills selected, assign these the new holdout material. We can move this layer to just above the mask, and then we can merge it down. Now the clouds with their holdout material have been added to the negative space of the original mask. Let's bring back our character. This is where we can now move or scale or tweak anything that we need. Once we're happy with it, we can go ahead and save our project. Final touches are always fun, but can be a little frustrating. Let's ease into it though, and just create a few bubbles being emitted from the gun. Now I'd like all of this to be on another grease pencil object, so I'm going to create one now, but keep it in the same collection, and call this one Bubbles. We imported a bubble brush at the beginning of the chapter, but just in case you need a refresher, I'm going to append another brush from the Chapter 3 exercise file. It is an alternate bubble I created, which has less transparency to it. Textures with transparency can be tricky, especially on lighter backgrounds. Toggle into draw mode. Select the bubble brush and paint on some bubbles coming from this gun. There might be some undoing and redoing as you go, so I'll tinker with my post-processing settings to get a few more points along the stroke. The hue has given some subtle variation to these bubbles, but to get some more control, let's first toggle into edit mode, select everything, then toggle into draw mode and select the tint brush. Modes such as vertex paint, weight paint, sculpt, and draw only will work on points and strokes that have been selected. If you haven't toggled into edit mode before, they're usually all selected, but this is just a troubleshooting step in case these things don't work. I like to drop my strength quite low and enable the pressure sensitivity. Remember that each bubble is a single point along the stroke. We'll select a color and softly paint on some random bubbles. Now toggle into object mode and swing out into perspective view. You might see some Z fighting between the background and character and maybe even the bubbles. This is because all of these grease pencil objects occupy the same point of origin in 3D space. Select the background object, hit the G key to grab, the Y key to constrain it to the Y-axis, and move this behind the character. Now I'll select the bubble object and toggle into edit mode. Selecting individual bubbles, I can move them around a little bit. Now occasionally you'll want to toggle back into camera view. This is done by hitting numpad 0 and making adjustments to objects such as scaling or repositioning so that you know that the composition is still working. Using 3D space like this is just one way we can expand on what Grease Pencil is capable of. In the next lesson, we're going to take it up to a whole other level. Though limited, Grease Pencil objects can interact with other Blender objects, modifiers, and functions. There's enough integration here to do some pretty amazing stuff. I'm going to rename the collection where all my Grease Pencil objects are to Main. And now, under the main scene, I'll create a new collection. I'm going to call this one Bubble Cloud. To save us a bit of time, let's duplicate the Bubbles Grease Pencil object, rename this to bubble_sprite.001, and move this into the new collection. Now let's hide our main collection. If you're in Render Viewport Shading, switch over to Material. I like to tweak my settings here just a little. I tend to disable my lighting options. Disabling Scene World will get Blender to adopt your theme's background color. Now this default is usually dark grey. This is so that in contrast to my rendered view, which I'll select now, you can see that I've enabled both my scene lights and scene world. I'll toggle back into Material Viewport Shading. Select the Bubble Sprite object and toggle into Edit mode. Make sure that everything is selected. Then Shift select a single bubble and delete the rest. Now toggle back into Object mode. Under the Object menu, set Origin, Geometry to Origin. Now the bubble should be perfectly centered at the Grease Pencil's own origin point. Open your Effects properties and add the blur effect to this bubble object. I'm going to increase my samples to 32 and tick the Use Depth of Field box. In the Object properties, I'm also going to make sure that the layer that this bubble is on has Use Lights enabled. Now hit Shift A, add a cube, and in Edit mode scale this down. Toggle back into Object mode and add a particle system to it from the modifier settings. In our particle properties, we're going to tweak a few settings. I'm going to lower this count. I'm going to increase the lifespan. I'm going to change the system from Newtonian to Boyd's, and under Render, change the Render as Halo to Object. This will allow us to select our Bubble Sprite object from the drop-down or by using the eyedropper tool and selecting it in our outliner. I'm also going to disable the emitter from rendering. Alright, let's run this simulation. If you'd like to, you can go ahead and adjust some more of these settings and rerun it until you get a frame which looks good through the camera. This is looking pretty good. We don't have to run the whole thing, just enough to get these bubbles spread out through our scene. Now, in our modifier properties for our cube, let's click on Make Instances Real. If all has gone correctly, you should now have hundreds of individual grease pencil bubble objects filling your scene. Now this is going to be a bit intensive on our system, so it's probably a good idea to cull, move, or scale objects that won't be seen by the camera. You can do this in object mode by box or lasso selecting, deleting, selecting a single bubble by clicking on it, and scaling it up and down. What we ideally want is a nice spread of bubbles from foreground to background with enough instances just outside the viewing area. The downside of this is that we won't be able to use the tint tool like we did previously, because these are all separate objects. But what we can do is add lights. Now I like to use point lights and place them in my camera collection. I'll give this light a color, increase its power, and position it near some bubbles. Now if nothing seems to work or you're having trouble navigating in 3D space, let's select a bubble that we really know we want to light. I'm going to snap cursor to selected. It doesn't matter if you can see it or not. Then select the light and snap object to cursor. Now you'll see the light illuminating this bubble very brightly, so you can position it more easily in relation to that bubble. Then we just duplicate and position the lights throughout our composition, altering the color and intensity so that the bubbles begin to take on random hues. Now we can unhide our main collection. Let's toggle our viewport shading back to render and select the camera. In the camera properties, enable depth of field, eyedropper select the bubble gun girl, and lower your f-stop so that the foreground and background bubbles all blur quite intensely. For my scene, it's about a 0.1 f-stop. If there's too much interference between the bubbles and the background object, just select your background object and move this further back so it doesn't intersect with any of the bubbles. You can scale this back up if necessary. Because this object doesn't have the blur effect on it, it won't be affected by the camera's depth of field. And there we have it, our completed grease pencil composition. The last step is to prepare this all for rendering and talk a little bit about the compositor. Rendering is our last step in the process, but it can be a little bit more involved than just hitting F12. There are things we can do to enhance or control in our image by learning just a few simple compositing tricks. Now, the first thing I like to do is a little bit of cleanup. I'll remove any unwanted or unused assets. I'll also disable this A4 trim mark that has assisted me in compositing. In my output properties, take a look at the render resolution. It's a good idea to think about where you're going to show or display this render. Is it purely for digital, or are you going to want to print this? Now the preset in this file will allow you to print to an A4 size at 300 dpi, but it can be easily altered or even rendered at a percentage of the overall size. For example, if you want to render an A5 instead of an A4, you can simply drop the render percentage to 50%. Let's render a frame. You should see a combined image pop up. And I think you'll agree that the white background is a little stark. Now, we can create a new sky background and tinker with the settings, but I'm going to show you a much more versatile way of changing your background. Go to your render properties, scroll down to the section labeled Film, and open it up. Tick the Transparent box. If you're in the rendered shading viewport, you should see the background now show the transparency grey checker pattern. Now switch over to your compositing workspace. I'll hit F12 again to do a render, and now I'll hit Escape so that I can toggle back into the compositor window. If they're not visible already, tick the Use Nodes box to enable the default nodes to show up. You can hit Home if they're not centered. You should see a Render Layers input and a Composite output. I want to see my render as a backdrop, so first I'll add a Viewer node. I'm also going to add a reroute node and place it on this line here. Then connect that to my viewer node. I'll move this reroute node quite close so that I can box select all of these three components and just move them down a little. I can now enable my backdrop and my render should show up behind. Now in your side panel, select your View tab. You can fit or move or reset your backdrop. You can zoom it in and out or offset. There are a couple of shortcut keys that will make your life a little bit easier. For example, if you want to move the backdrop, you'll hold down Alt and use your middle mouse button to move your background render around. If you just middle mouse select, your nodes will move over your background render. Now let's begin to split up this composite. I'm going to add an alpha over node and plug in the image output to the second image input of this node. And in the first image input, I'll choose a color from the swatch here by clicking on the color swatch and just picking any color I want. Now the background should be replaced with this color. Let's add a gradient. I'll do this by adding a texture input node. Now we may not have any textures to work with right now, but this doesn't matter just yet. Let's plug this into the first image slot. Then over in your texture properties panel, add a new blend texture. I'm going to call mine gradient, and back on my texture node, select it from the drop-down. I'm going to play around with my texture settings a little bit. I'm going to switch my orientation to vertical. Then I'll open up my colors and enable the color ramp. I can choose to change these color swatches, move them around on the ramp, even add more if I wish. All of these updates should appear in your compositor fairly quickly. I like where this is going. But what if I wanted to separate this background element and have more control over it without ruining any of the rest of the elements in this scene? In our outliner, let's create a new collection. I'm going to call this background, and I'm going to move my background grease pencil object into it. I'm now going to exclude this from my view layer. I only have one view layer, so let's rename this to foreground. Now I'm going to add another view layer by clicking this icon over here, and I'm going to copy my settings. I'm going to call this second view layer background. I will include the background collection, but exclude the main and the bubble cloud collections. Back in my compositor, I'll duplicate my render layers. On this duplicate, I'm going to select background from the drop-down. If you want to update the renders on these two render layers, you can hit this little icon next to where it says foreground or background on these two layers, so that we have some updated renders to work with. I now want to recombine these two assets. So I'm going to duplicate my alpha over node, move it over here, and input my background layer into the first image slot, and input my foreground render layer into my second image slot. Now I'll plug this back into the second image slot of the original alpha over node. I'm going to drop the alpha of this by adding a set alpha node and placing it here between my background render layers input and the first alpha over node. And then I can drop the alpha quite low so this background is a lot more transparent. Finally, let's tweak some of the color balance to get a little bit more vibrancy and make this image really pop. I'll add a color balance node and place it here, just before all of the images are combined into our composite. Generally, I like to drop my lift a little bit and drop my gain and increase my gamma. I can give each of these a slight coloration and even control how much this color balance is factored into the final composite. Now, at any time, you have the ability to go back in any step of the process, add more effects to various components of the image, swap out a background texture, recolor, and more. Now I'm pretty happy with these results. I'm going to go over to my render workspace and open up my render result just to check out my final. Then under image, I can go save as and save out this final image. As mentioned at the beginning of this course, all of the working files are available. So if you want to jump in at any point, you can just open up a progress file for this illustration and take it from there. Thanks for sticking with me this far. I really hope you've learned a lot about the grease pencil and feel more confident when using this remarkable tool. My name is Paul Kajeji, and I've been your instructor for CG Cookie.